It could happen tomorrow, the moment that changes the course of human events forever. The ultimate admission to the ultimate lie, the disclosure once and for all that we are not alone. Should such a day arrive, it will certainly herald a new dawn for humanity. Today, however, the debate rages on. Will such an event ever happen?
Paradigm Research Group once again calls upon the administration of President Barack Obama to engage the leadership of the military services and the national security structures to essentially work out the details to conduct a formal acknowledgement to the American people of the extraterrestrial presence engaging the human race.
The problem we have today is we also have other issues that affect all of us too, and immediately so. Wars, economies, famines, disease. And that's why our subject tends to be put on the back burner, because it doesn't have that feeling of immediacy yet. But when it does, it'll be a major story.
When I talk about disclosure, I talk about it with a small d. And I simply mean that the British government and others, the French, Canadians, Brazilians, and other countries as well, are literally declassifying and releasing their archive of UFO files. They are disclosing them. What there isn't in any of these files is what I call a spaceship in a hangar smoking gun. If there is such a document somewhere in a file, either in Britain or in another country, I haven't seen it.
There is another intelligence that's been interacting with humans for a long time. We can prove it in a variety of different ways. Tens of millions of people have seen it over the years in one form or another over the centuries throughout human history. On every continent, in every country, in every culture, in different guises, under different names, but it's there and it's real, and it has interacted with us at one level or another for a very long time. The evidence is overwhelming, I think, in other ways, too. Government documents, for example, U.S. government documents, Russian, Brazilian, British.
To the shock of many, many people, thousands of pages of documents relating to UFOs were released by many government agencies, the FBI, CIA, many of the defense agencies, released documents pertaining to UFOs that were requisitioned by UFO researchers from the National Archives. These were documents that were created back in the 50s and 60s with no expectation that they would ever see the light of day.
And what I am suggesting is it is now time to put away this embargo of truth about the alien presence. And I call upon our government to open up like other governments have, and you will hear about that this morning. Like the Belgians have, the French have, the Brazilians have, the Argentines, the Mexicans have all released their files. It's about time now that we do the same thing and become a part of this planetary community that is now trying to take our proper role as spacefaring civilization.
Disclosure with the UFO community is often written with a large D and is almost a political issue. It's a belief that there is an extraterrestrial presence, that the government absolutely does know about this and has known about it for more than 60 years. And the disclosure movement, lobby, whatever you want to call it, is gearing itself really for a fight with the government, with the authorities, to say, come on, it's time to release that material. My view is, well, it depends what you think there is to release.
When you talk about disclosure, disclose what? That aliens are real? I'm not sure anybody knows the true answer to this. Even though there might be a gigantic storehouse of information about UFO sightings, I'm not sure anyone really knows where they're from, why they're here, what they want. Those are the big questions. You know, we've been studying UFOs for 60 years, and I don't think we're one step closer to knowing the answer to any of the really central big questions.
For years and years, the U.S. government had said, well, we don't really study the UFO issue, we're not interested. Suddenly, that lie was exposed very clearly. A number of these documents are absolutely top-rate fascinating documents. Now, I wouldn't say that any one of them by themselves would offer proof that UFOs are alien, let's say. However, when you take the top 10, top 20, they provide overwhelming evidence that A, the phenomenon is real, B, very serious, and C, of grave concern to military authorities. For instance, there's one that's very well known to researchers. Let's call it the 1947 Twining Memo. This was written by three-star general at the time, General Nathan Twining. He later went on to get 4 stars and become Chief of Staff of the Air Force. In 1947, he was responding to a request by another general who wanted to know, essentially, what was all this flying saucer business about? Are we making it? Are we not making it? Do I have to do anything about it? To which Twining wrote a multiple-page document saying, the reported phenomenon is real, not visionary or fictitious. And then he, incredibly, goes on to describe the nature of these objects as they were coming into the military personnel who were reporting them, including metallic, round on top, domed on top, flat on the bottom. Now, what is domed on top and flat on the bottom, especially in 1947? Silent or nearly so, very quiet, evasive maneuvers when sighted, and so forth. And so this is not evidence, but proof that in 1947, a top U.S. general is confirming the existence of this phenomenon. And you can just take it from there. Through the rest of the 40s, through the 50s and 60s, we've got dozens of excellent documents showing the scrambling of U.S. jet interceptors to intercept objects that were round or disc-shaped, hovering and hanging out over very sensitive U.S. military installations, including nuclear sites like Los Alamos and Oak Ridge and Hanford. You know, back in those days, you don't just go and fly over these restricted places. It was a big deal, and the base commanders were deeply concerned over this. And so we've got really scores of excellent documents relating to that. To me, that's more than sufficient to show that something's going on. It doesn't have to prove that it's alien, but guess what? What we find out is that all of the analysts back then asked all of the logical questions that we would ask. Top on the list is, top on the list is, were the Soviets making them? Are we making them? Or are they interplanetary? That was the big phrase that they were using. And inevitably, with all of these various studies that took place within the military, there was always a significant faction that said, well, they look interplanetary.
For me, there are 2 really important factors to overcome. The first is the ridicule factor. It is so virulent, it is so powerful, and it is so ingrained in post-war Western society. The fact that it has been the subject itself of UFOs and their implications have been so wonderfully stirred into a soup.
The fear of ridicule is the prominent concern from everybody. I check my audiences after my lecture. Flying saucers are real. How many people here believe they've seen what I would consider to be a flying saucer? Just raise your hand. We didn't let the CIA in, make a joke or 2. And now they trust me because the lecture's flying saucers are real. And the hands go up. I'll just point and count. 1, 2, 3. The hands go up, reluctantly, but they trust me. By the time I get to that side of the hall, they go up rapidly. They suddenly realize they're not the only one. And typically it's 10% of the audience. So if you got 500 people, I've had audiences as big as 2,000. 500 people even, that's 50 sightings. But see, then I ask another question. How many of you reported what you saw? 90% of the hands come down.
I think the whole idea of disclosure is tenuous at best. And if the government doesn't know what it is that they're dealing with, how are they going to disclose that and admit that they don't know? It's not going to happen.
What I think needs to happen at this time is not disclosure per se, because I don't think there is much to disclose. What I think needs to happen is we need to make it okay, permissible, for serious scientists who want to explore these fields to do this without destroying their personal reputation or destroying their livelihood, because if you dabble in these things, we're not going to allow you to have a job in other areas.
In 1953, the CIA convened what's called the Robertson Panel, and they discussed it. And they talked about, look, let's look at these UFO cases. We don't think that UFOs represent a threat to national security, but the continued reporting about UFOs is a threat. Therefore, let's institute a program to strip UFOs of their aura of mystery. And that's where they talked about debunking the laughter curtain, the ridicule factor. And whether or not that program was ever instituted or not, it's in effect what's happened, because people do laugh at people who report UFOs. 9 out of every 10 persons who sees a UFO or has some experience like that doesn't report it at all. And the fear factor is a major part of that.
I have been convinced for years that it's this great paradox. It's an impossibility for the powers that be to want to disclose this, and I've never seen motivation on their part to do it. However, it's going to happen anyway. It's like trying to hold back a tidal wave.
Why hasn't official acknowledgement occurred? Is there truly nothing to disclose? Or is the truth so shattering that no easy way to inform us has presented itself? Has there actually been, as many seem to believe, an intricate international truth embargo?
And it's clear that those very early sightings, many were exceptional, like pilots and people like that, that the US Air Force then did a sort of a study which resulted in what's called the estimate of the situation, and that document assessed that in 1948 the general conclusion was that they were more likely to be extraterrestrial. That was presented to General Vandenberg, who rejected it. He said, I can't deal with this, we're not doing that. And at that point, on military terms, especially in light of the possibility of the Third World War, and we're into a Cold War era with the Soviets, that I think maybe the military made the decision for the president and said, no, we ain't going to let this go because this could trigger the world, this could destabilize the world, this is just dynamite. And there may be good reasons why they decided to keep it secret then. But the decision was made that from now on, after 48, this is going to be downplayed, debunked, we're going to write everything off as balloons, astronomic phenomena, misinterpretation, birds, whatever.
The truth embargo, the containment of this issue, really got formally underway after the Robertson panel convened in late 1952.
Of course, I would say it was underway years before that, but that kind of formalized it.
Yeah, I meant formal, right? I mean, technically, they were doing things to contain it before, but they really went into high gear because, as you know, in July, there was this major event in Washington.
It was a public hearing, whereas a lot of the things that were done in the 5 or 6 years leading up to that were all done in secrecy and privacy.
But almost certainly there was a private, probably, component to that public hearing that we didn't know about.
The Robertson hearing.
But we do know there was a sequence of events, mainly Roswell in '47. 5 years go by, lots happening.
And as you mentioned, a major temperature inversion over Washington that caused the illusion.
Oh yeah, and then July
caused the illusion of 7 or 8 flying saucers. That's
my understanding was it scared the hell out of the government and the military intelligence people because they realized we really can't contain this. We can't stop them from doing what they want to do.
If we rewind the clock back to the 1940s and pretend that we're in with the in crowd and we discover that yes, this phenomenon appears to be involving non-human intelligences. And not only that, but we've recovered some of their technology. So this presents us with a very difficult situation. What do we do about it? Do we tell the world? I have a feeling that some of the decision makers, maybe even Harry Truman, might have had an instinct to want to tell the world. I don't think that they wanted to be bad guys here. But they had a couple of things to consider. One was the existence of this Cold War, whereby if you tell the world you've got this piece of alien artifact, suddenly it becomes very difficult not to share it. It's easier just to keep it to yourself if you don't tell anyone that you've got it. And if you keep it to yourself, then you can have your scientists study it. You can figure out all kinds of new scientific pieces of information and give yourself leverage in this Cold War. And I really believe that this is a prime early motivation. I think it's entirely likely that somebody like Truman would have said, well, let's figure out a game plan here. We've got this technology, and we also don't want to panic the world. So what I'm going to do is convene this group of people, and your job will be to figure out what we can do with the technology. Your job will be to manage the media. Your job will be to find out how bad public panic might be. And your job will be to find out who these other beings are, and so forth. I think that's exactly what happened.
The institutionalization of that process of secrecy, that piece of sand around which is now a huge pearl, calcified over 63 years. I've read enough of President Truman's writings and have enough of a sense of him as somebody who's interested in American history to know that he probably wanted to go public with this.
Yeah, I think he was a good guy and he wanted to do the right thing.
I think what happened was he called the best wagons into the circle. They met, they discussed, they analyzed, and had he been able to fully exercise his power, unless he was convinced that, whoa, maybe we better slow down here. I think what happened is what happens a lot of times in human affairs. A group established to create something or to oversee something institutionalizes itself, and its first priority is no longer to solve the problem it was created for, it is to stay alive and keep growing. So I think it kind of calcified, and the people who are now in the role of, say, the original MJ-12 people or whatever it was actually back then are still the secret, quiet, unelected, appointed bureaucrats.
And I had conversation with one very high-level government insider who had, in fact, told me point blank that, yes, every 5 years or so, this issue comes up in terms of policy. That is, how to initiate a disclosure of the UFO ET reality. Because the fact is that there are many people at the high levels who do believe this secret needs to come out. All ruling elites have their factions. Not everyone agrees, and in our own society there are those who want this out. The problem that they come up with, well, there are manifold, but one of them is legal. There's a fear, it sounds so mundane, but a fear of lawsuits. Not simply private class action lawsuits, but industrial lawsuits, business lawsuits by one contractor against another because that contractor would have had access to exotic ET technology, violating trade practices and fair trade and so forth. Simple things, very mundane, but when you think about it, it's, yes, that makes perfect sense. And the issue is, where do you draw the line at no retribution? Should there be absolutely zero, or should there be some, maybe no jail sentences? It's a very difficult issue, and I doubt that it's going to be resolved overnight. I think it's going to be a very long process. There's got to be a general tone that comes up early on, which explains that we're not out for blood here, all right? The fact is that the UFO secret has involved extra-constitutional means of keeping it going. It's involved an end run around Congress in terms of funding what we now believe are deeply secret programs to study and replicate this technology. That cost a lot of money. The whole Constitution's been subverted by the UFO secret.
There was a congressional investigator that I worked with for a number of years who had highest security clearances. He was looking into the story about Area 51, and he was looking into the possibility that a cover-up existed, that it had existed for a long time. The possibility was that millions, maybe tens of millions of dollars that otherwise would have gone into legitimate national security programs for our military, for the defense of our country, had been siphoned away from these legitimate programs and used to keep this cover-up going, to perpetuate a conspiracy of sorts, to deny information to the American public and to the world. And he told me at the time, he said, look, if this story turns out to be true, these people are going to go to jail. They will go to jail. So that's a very down-to-earth reason why the cover-up could be maintained. I think the other reason would be, look, they've been lying about it for a long time. Even if they didn't steal money to keep the lie going, they painted themselves into a corner and don't really know what to say.
At the heart of this hotly contested field, one thing remains clear. Something we can't fully explain is certainly happening. Unexplained aerial phenomenon is real. But how did this phenomenon turn into the modern mythos we are surrounded by today? Although stories of unexplained and even extraterrestrial influences can be traced back to the earliest known texts, the modern age of the UFO began with the study of mysterious Foo Fighters, objects seen in the air by Allied pilots throughout World War II. Mysterious ghost rocket sightings in the skies over Sweden in 1946 later added to the concern of military and government officials, but still escaped the public eye. It was early in July 1947 that the infamous Kenneth Arnold sighting captured headlines and gave birth to the term flying saucers. A wave of sightings spread across the Midwest, culminating with the Roswell incident, in which the government announced and then rescinded the acknowledgement of a crashed flying disc near Corona, New Mexico.
The advent of institutionalizing ridicule began the summer of 1947. American newspapers and radio broadcasts, of course, began to cover it immediately with Kenneth Arnold. And the reason I believe that the Arnold sightings were picked up and went out on the wire services, and once it was news here, it was news around the world, is because while Arnold was on that fateful trip that he saw those craft and was able to estimate their speed based on the distance between mountain peaks they were moving, there was a small plane down somewhere in the Cascades, and so there were a lot of air patrols out, and there were reporters at the airport when he landed and gave his account, and so they picked it up and put it on the wire service.
So right time, right place.
Exactly. So we have the Arnold situation, and then give or take about 2 weeks later things go down in the plains outside of Roswell, New Mexico.
Yep.
So at this point, American media becomes fully engaged, and I had thought, before I fully researched it, that the birth of the ridicule factor must have been gradual. It's a compelling story, who wouldn't want to cover it? And that maybe, over the first couple of years there were some hoaxes, and you know how skittish the newspaper is. Just look at the crop circle phenomena. When they pulled the wool over Colin Andrews' eyes, it set back the work for years because we don't want to get involved in calling something real if it's a fake. We have our pride. Well, it actually began instantaneously, the first week in July when the New York Times started to cover it. Arguably, the Times is the flagship of America's journalistic community, and certainly was then. And with their very first coverage, it wasn't the crash at Roswell. They picked it up a few days later with, it was just a weather balloon. But the quality of the reportage was informed by sarcasm, innuendo, condescending, and if you couldn't explain away the case, then you attack the credibility of the witnesses.
Which is a classic disinformation exercise.
You also bring in quote-unquote authorities, almost always unnamed, and almost always a psychologist or an astronomer. They love that.
They must know better.
Exactly. So what we see from the get-go, and other newspapers around the country pick up the cue from the Times, because if it is truly a silly topic, what editor, publisher, or reporter wants to be the one to go against it and lose their credibility?
Is there a connection between secret agendas and the media? While always staunchly denied, evidence and testimony exists, scattered throughout the official record, that operations such as the CIA's Operation Mockingbird infiltrated and influenced the media and the dissemination of information in ways that stretch far beyond our perception of a free press.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?
We do have people who submit pieces to American journals.
Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks?
This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
In the earliest days of this phenomenon, did the government's influence extend to Hollywood and popular entertainment as well? Did hidden messages and secret truths filter into the collective consciousness through the fiction of cinema?
War of the Worlds, Orson Welles radio broadcast, I believe that was 1938, shook people up. It certainly, if there was a lesson to be drawn from it, it's that you can't trust the public with information that's bizarre and scary. And it deals with an invasion, possible invasion from space.
Now, I've talked about this.
Panic.
I've talked about this. You know, I take a very different take on that.
Okay.
So when you look at the broadcast, what you really had there, right, was you had a broadcast in which they were simulating the actual radio network, all right? And they were giving out disclaimers, but probably not enough, and a bunch of people jumped over to the show from another popular show and jumped into the middle of it.
Right.
And so what happened is that people think they're listening to an authoritative source.
Because they missed the beginning.
Because they missed the beginning, and they're getting this information that's very scary.
Yeah.
And so to me, the important lesson there was not, gee, if people are told scary things, they'll panic, but rather what happens when an authoritative source gives you bad information. Sure, you can easily make people panic. If ABC News tomorrow was to decide to play a little joke on the American people and suddenly throw in a 5-minute news brief thing.
Create Independence Day as though it were a real news event and it was really happening.
All right. And so, yeah, would that prove that people, we know that people can panic, but the real message from the War of the Worlds and Orson Welles' thing was, the authoritative sources should not lie to the people. And so I absolutely believe that one way or another, Hollywood is hip deep in this, but we just don't know what the connections are. But well, we know this. This is a fact. We know that Hollywood repeatedly has to go to the government and the military for their cooperation in order to make movies, right? And oftentimes they don't get that cooperation. It can actually kill a flick.
Or they make it anyway. We've been reading about the Hurt Locker.
Right.
Which got some resistance.
And this has happened. But overall, they want the cooperation. So the interaction between Hollywood and the military and so forth is known.
Sometimes the cooperation is almost a marriage.
Yeah, it is. And so there's plenty of this going on. Plenty of handshaking, plenty of goodwill, back and forth. Occasionally they get crosswise, but overall there's a powerful connection there.
And there were a couple of very interesting movies at that.
Between 47 and 52?
Sure.
Oh yeah, I would assume
well, there's
so.
Three I would talk about. Okay, the most straight-laced one was Destination Moon.
I remember.
George Powell's production, based on the concepts of Werner von Braun, the imaginative illustrations of Willy Ley, showing how we would and could get to the moon, and making the voyage credible and real for a lot of people, that this was our destiny. And this was around 49 that it came out. In the next 2 years, you get two very, very interesting films. One is The Day the Earth Stood Still, directed by Robert Wise, a classic masterpiece of a warning from space.
Right.
About mankind's errant ways with atomic weapons. And either we change our ways, or the intergalactic community in that story was going to deal with us very harshly. They had their robot enforcers. This one was called Gort. And they made a demonstration by turning off all the electricity in the world to show what their power was.
And of course that film was just remade.
Going on to 1952. Actually, there's two more that are of great importance. One is Howard Hawks' film, The Thing from Another World.
Right.
The Thing was the Roswell story, the story of the crash of a flying saucer, but reset, not in the desert of the Southwest, but in the Arctic.
Okay.
The flying saucer crashes into the ice. The people who are there at the military base, it crashes near, look under the ice, they see the round shape of it, and there's one alien from that ship who's still alive, who appears around their research base and scares the hell out of people. It's a beast. Then you've got War of the Worlds, George Powell. Again.
It was before 52?
It was, I believe it was 52.
That brings me to the exopolitical questions that I want to ask you about this. And this is pretty significant.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have 47 to 52. There's a public awareness growing, and Hollywood makes these movies.
Right.
Then in 52, in July, we have this extraordinary events in Washington which really shook up the troops. That leads very quickly to a panel which is given a public, some public exposure, which, as we know from looking back at the records, calls for the debunking of this issue in a matter of national security. Roswell happens in 1947. There was an announcement in the paper. It wasn't like it totally disappeared right away. How many people in Hollywood knew about Roswell? how many people learned about it a little bit later? In other words, what was the awareness in Hollywood of the Roswell event? Also, of course, the people in Hollywood knew that the sightings were taking place. They knew about the Kenneth Arnold sighting. That was heavily in the news, and other sightings were taking place. And so there were people in Hollywood that were seeing something going on. Now, these people are powerful, right? Particularly those big, you know, this is back in the days when the Hollywood
Louis B.
producer
Mayer,
were
MGM,
kings, right, yeah.
Warner
they were
Brothers.
heavily connected, very wealthy.
Yeah.
You just know that some of them must have called up their government contacts and friends and saying, what the hell's going on here?
Well, this will interest you that Robert Wise, who directed The Day the Earth Stood Still, told me personally in an interview I had with him before I got the Roswell movie approved for production. He told me that on the set, while they were filming The Day the Earth Stood Still, is when he started to hear lots and lots of stories about this is true. This has really happened. He said from credible people, from engineers, from people that he respected, he became persuaded that this was real, that it was being withheld.
We have one top director who
he told me
may be convinced the ET presence is real as early as 1952.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, there may have been more.
Yeah.
And they talked to each other. So whether or not the government went to Hollywood and back channels and said, look, we'd like you to help out a little bit here. We got a problem here. National security is involved.
Did it help? Did it help?
Well, that's the thing. There's a number of people out there right now. I know one gentleman named Robbie Graham who's doing some excellent work in the UK. You've done the same thing. Paula Harris is doing the same thing. People are starting to pay more attention and look at this huge body of work from 47 forward.
Yeah.
And start looking for connections. Just like Zachariah Sitchin and Von Daniken are looking through ancient texts 10,000 years ago trying to find these connections.
We haven't mentioned Earth versus the Flying Saucers,
yes.
1955, which says that it was based on a book by Major Donald Kehoe. Flying saucers are real.
So there's an intersection. And the question is there a thread in, because not everybody's on the same page. And the government didn't need and couldn't have Hollywood in lockstep on this because it would be obvious. But to seed some things in there and say, look, we need that idea out, we need this idea out. But there was an awareness factor within the Hollywood professionals themselves. Sure. They read the news, they have their own contacts, and so there's an incredibly complex dynamic going on here.
And you take a movie from, what was it, about 1956, like Forbidden Planet. There you've got an absolutely seminal breakthrough of inculcating the public with new ideas that are really important, that have to do with advanced alien technology. It was not just that this advanced extraterrestrial technology existed on a planet that was where the living creatures were deceased, but their technology went on, but that there was one Earth human there, played by Walter Pidgeon, Dr. Morbius, who himself took it upon himself to study the secrets of the Krell. And there's a very important line of dialogue in there where he tells the captain of this spaceship that has come to supposedly rescue him on the planet Altair 4, where he says, I have been deciphering, studying, this is my work, and I will, from time to time, when I see fit, and when I think the people of Earth can handle it, send back some of the things that I have learned. There's your embargo.
While the question of Hollywood's role in disclosure remains a subject with many opinions, it can definitely be said that Hollywood was instrumental in propagating the concept of a dangerous alien threat.
The government has the crash vehicle at Roswell. The government is starting to realize that they have serious limitations to how much they're going to be able to control this, and they don't know how well they can control. A lot of unknowns here. They've got a lot of people inside government that obviously are aware of the ET presence because of the roles they're playing and what have you. It could be hundreds, could have been thousands. And clearly one way to contain those people from rushing down to the New York Times is to say, look, we don't know what's going on. These aliens could be really scary, really deadly. They could pose a threat to the human race. And until we know, you better keep your damn mouth shut. And so, lo and behold, you get the War of the Worlds, and you get The Thing, which, as you say, mimics Roswell.
But Steve,
those could have been messages to the people inside government.
I don't know. I mean, it's
I
possible,
know we can't know, but I think it's worth looking at it.
But the one film I want to add to our list from that period that I think is at least as important as all of the others was a film called Invaders from Mars. It was early 1950s. It was the story of a small boy living near a military base who sees a flying saucer come down and go underground, under the sand dunes. They're capturing people, taking them underground, and what are they doing? They're putting implants into them.
Yes.
They make them unconscious. They have a drill that goes into the back of the neck. And once, this happens to the little boy's parents, once these people have an implant, they're not normal human beings anymore. You know, the behavior of the boy's parents completely change, and they tell everybody to shut up, and they start denying the strange activities that are happening.
And this raises an important point, Paul. We know from the last 25 years of the contact evidence that's emerged that it's very likely ETs are putting implants in human beings. And when you look at this, if you look at the emerging evidence regarding the ET presence, and then you look at the film, there is just tons of correspondence.
A lot
here.
of parallels.
All right. And so clearly, people in Hollywood are looking at the research, they're looking at this emerging evidence. We know that.
Now, you asked about these Hollywood connections and the awareness of the Roswell story. There's one little connection that I've found, I've noticed from War of the Worlds, that's intrigued me. The Roswell crash happened actually not in the town of Roswell, but in Corona.
Right.
Corona. And in the movie War of the Worlds, everybody can check this out on their DVD. When Gene Barry is holed up in the farmhouse, don't forget, Roswell crashed by a farmhouse, a ranch house.
Right.
He's holed up in the farmhouse with Ann Robinson, the leading lady of the film. And they finally get their way back to civilization. And they tell where it was that they were holed up, where this flying saucer crashed down into the farmhouse. He says it was in Corona.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Corona.
I missed that.
Corona, California, mind you. There's a Corona in California.
Yeah.
Because the thing was set in Los Angeles.
Right.
But they still chose it to be Corona, which is where the New Mexico crash actually happened, in a setting very much like they dramatized.
Now, that's good stuff. All right, now,
And there was one alien running around that farmhouse.
Right.
Okay.
Right. All right. Now, I want to do something. Let's really give ourselves a nosebleed. I want to now leap.
You can have the nosebleed.
I want to leap all the way from 1952 to the present.
With a rich and controversial history of obvious collusion, is Hollywood and the mainstream media still playing an active role in any truth embargo? Or is the media now playing an active and ongoing role in a process of disclosure?
There is sort of disclosure happening in incremental levels going around the media, going around science, and going around the government. And it is so common on the History Channel and elsewhere that it's almost a given. There's so much of this stuff. I sometimes worry about UFO overload, that maybe we're getting too much, so much that people don't think about it. There's so many stories about aliens and ETs and UFOs and flying saucers that, and they're presented by the History Channel, and they're done very well. But the fact is that it's always going to be viewed as entertainment. Until it's on 60 Minutes, until it's on the front page of the New York Times, it's not news. It's still entertainment. And I just don't see it having the same kind of impact.
Like Dr. Edgar Mitchell says we have been visited. Dr. Edgar Mitchell comes with unprecedented, unquestioned credentials. And for someone of his stature, and there are many others from the military and all aspects of life, careers, to acknowledge this, and yet for the mainstream media to continue to ignore the issue or to treat it with lightness, you know, the funny story at the end of a newscast, whatever, and not take it and not treat it seriously is unforgivable. And you and I both have been in mainstream newsrooms for
all the
years,
way, yeah.
not alternative newsrooms.
Exactly.
You've been a news director.
Yeah.
I've been a CNN news anchor and reporter. And we've had various other times of service with mainstream news through the years. And I know you must have seen the same thing and felt the same thing that I experienced, and that is there's an unwritten rule. It's not in print, but there's just certain areas you don't go to. There are certain subjects you don't approach, and that's one of them. You don't take it to the assignment editor to see if you can pitch a story, generally speaking, because they'd say, well, what's she going to come up with next?
You just have to see who owns the media. I interviewed Dr. Stephen Greer, who told me and did an interview, fantastic, really intellectual interview about the death of the Fourth Estate, about the death of the media, because they're bought by transnational companies, so they can only produce what that transnational company wants it to produce. And Dr. Greer told me that when he got all the Disclosure Project witnesses, who are not ufologists, they're all military people, people that would swear before Congress of what they saw, and he went to Wallace and in the major media, 2020 and all that, they got an order from top down saying that they could not put it on the air. And there's many reasons why they couldn't put it on the air. If this becomes too credible, then you're going to unravel a tapestry, starting with Roswell, of a series of lies. And then where does it stop? I mean, it gets crazy.
I was so frustrated as a young reporter in my early days because the news director would laugh at me. I'd say, here's this great tip. Let's go and spend the night at this family's house. They see UFOs at night.
Right.
And he said, no, we're not going to spend the money. I don't want to do it. And we're just not going to do it. Here, George, go cover this fire. Go cover this murder. It wasn't until I finally got into news management where I started assigning my own reporters these kinds of stories that we had with a little twist and with a little edge. And that was very unconventional in Detroit, for example, to do that.
So we've kind of given people a picture of what was happening in film and a little bit of the UFO phenomena as it was developing in those years. And this long embargo takes place. And now it's 2010. And a movie hits the screens with another 60 years of technology development behind it, and takes off and is now on its way to becoming the highest grossing movie of all time. This movie, Avatar, will probably exceed $3 billion. And it's not only about extraterrestrials, which is non-trivial, though quite attractive extraterrestrials, I might add, but it's about extraterrestrials on another moon being attacked by human beings and Vietnam-type helicopters. And it's filled with political messages. They're all over the place. It's got the Native American issue in there. It's got it all. And so it's to me, Hollywood now on this issue is virtually unleashed. I think the truth embargo has not been significantly energized since 1999. And so about 8 years later, James Cameron comes out with this film. This movie is so loaded with exopolitical messages.
It's a tour de force that is one of America's major exports to the world right now.
Yeah, we just exported exopolitics to the world big time.
I don't necessarily agree with the way you're characterizing the, Hollywood being in bed with it's not what it is. I mean, Hollywood makes stories about such a variety of subjects. Everything that's interesting has been touched, and people are employed to look for what's going to appeal to people, what's going to bring an audience.
True.
And they try to second guess and avoid making those films they think that no one is going to care about. And sometimes they're right and sometimes they're wrong. But it's the Wild West. There's nobody controlling what gets made. The decisions for what gets made, sometimes they're made on huge budgets of over $100 million by major studios, major corporations, and sometimes influential films are made by small producers working with less than $1 million. And there's no rhyme or reason to any of it.
This is true. It has broadened.
And you just need to let it go at that.
In 1277, the Catholic Church introduced the Many Worlds Edict, iterating that the possibility of extraterrestrial life did not conflict with the role of God in traditional religious teachings. This is simply proof that the religious establishment has been aware of this issue for centuries. How important is the support of the world's religious authorities in any disclosure agenda?
I think what we really want is we want to see this object, this craft, whatever it is, land somewhere in a field where people by the masses can see it, where the news media would broadcast live and say, my gosh, they're here, like Independence Day. I think we're waiting for that, and people are frustrated that that's not happening. For whatever reason, if we believe that we're being visited, they really don't want us to know about it in a direct way. Indirectly, of course. If you believe in the abductions and the crop formations and the cattle mutilations, these things are all happening indirectly, almost in a hidden way.
I don't know how to explain it, but I think the phenomena itself seem to be pointing at the direction that somehow it's all connected. Maybe there are alternate dimensions, parallel universes, or maybe it's just meant to make us think. You could say that there's a learning curve, that something is bringing us along slowly, that it's always been with us as humans, and it's meant to make us think outside the box. And that seems to be exactly what's going on with the trickster phenomena, to make us think in a different way. Jacques Vallée refers to it in his book, Passport to Magonia. He refers to the unbelievability, a series of consequences that seem created to be unbelievable. And B.F. Skinner, the great behaviorist, talks about it's a great way to teach somebody something is to do it over and over again in different and unpredictable ways, and they remember it. I don't know if that's the explanation or not, but it's an interesting framework with which to look at this stuff.
Just finishing up is the Vatican now, a 5-day conference on aliens.
What is exceptional is that the Vatican was taking very seriously what science might tell us about the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligent life forms. That's what the conference was about.
As far as theological issues, well, certainly, look, let's get right down to it in the issue of Christianity. Because if we get to the idea that there's an extraterrestrial presence here, now we're going to get into the issue, as some have claimed, that Christ was, in fact, an extraterrestrial himself. This issue will be raised.
Sure will.
And so what would that do? Let me turn the tables and ask you this question. What would that do to Christianity?
Surprisingly, this issue has been discussed for quite some time with Catholic Christianity. It started out as a discussion called the Many Worlds discussion. Father Fuentes, back on November 10th, when he announced this need to probe these fundamental philosophical and theological questions at the press conference at the Vatican, he actually said that his position was that it would be placing limits upon the creativity of God to deny that there could be other worlds and other intelligent civilizations. Well, even though he didn't quote the actual source of that, that was a 1277 edict that was actually issued by the Catholic Bishop of Rome.
That's fascinating.
His name was Etienne Tempier. He was the Catholic Bishop of Rome, and he was in a major confrontation going on with Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas was engaged in the process of trying to superimpose upon the mystical Christianity of the Catholic Church of the Middle Ages a radical Aristotelian, scientific, logical worldview. So that there's a long history of this going on in the Catholic Christology. The thing that's so exhilarating about this is that this intervention on the part of the extraterrestrial beings is going to compel the church to come to grips with modernizing its entire communications to the people about what they mean about all of this stuff. And the fact of the matter is that if in fact one recognizes, as Teilhard de Chardin was attempting to explicate, that Jesus appears to be a biological mutation, a classic biological mutation in the ever-unfolding evolution of our human family, in which he had fully evolved a faculty which is generic to the entire human family, that is evolving a sixth sense, like seeing or hearing or tasting, that he had a faculty by means of which he could directly experientially access, like seeing or hearing, the unitive phenomenon that bonds the entire universe into unitive harmony. And that therefore, that he also could intuitively know that the physical universe was enfolded into being by an infinite and an eternal, absolute, infinite sea of entirely undifferentiated consciousness.
I couldn't help at one point in my discussions privately with General Secretary Gorbachev, when you stop to think that we're all God's children wherever we may live in the world, I couldn't help but say to him, just think how easy his task and mine might be in these meetings that we held if suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe. We'd forget all the little local differences that we have between our countries, and we would find out once and for all that we really are all human beings here on this earth together.
If there is to be an official disclosure, or other event that brings extraterrestrial phenomenon into the public arena, then many elements of society are going to have to be in alignment to allow a smooth acceptance and integration of this information. What does that look like in detail?
Again, I don't think disclosure is going to come from government. I think it will come from an accident. And if for some reason this world truly understands and recognizes the ET contact and why it's happening, it may very well come from an earth-wide calamity, I think, where they do something that they haven't done before, and that is to step in and to say, you need to know about this, and we're going to do it, and we're going to tell you.
How do you think they would step in, though?
Well, let's say they know an asteroid is coming that could shatter this planet in half. I think they may come forward and tell us. I truly believe that if this planet's been visited, and I believe we have, the data and research that I've seen and the guests that I've interviewed have convinced me we're being visited and have been since the beginning of time. I think they would come forward. I think they monitor us. I think they know what's going on years ahead of us. And I think they would come forward and simply say, prepare yourselves, folks.
The political structures are not going to release the factual reality of this until they're convinced that the philosophical and theological ground has been set for people to accept it, because they aren't going to want to suffer the political consequences. And so that I think that what we need to do, that I believe that until such time as we, as the laity of the churches and the civilians in the governmental structures, demonstrate that we're basically just not going to stand for this anymore. That the fact of the matter is we're not going to sit here like adolescents and wait for our father figures to tell us it's okay, to tell us that, that okay, it exists, and here's what the theological explanation of this is, and here's the philosophical, that we need to do this ourselves. We need to take to heart basically the lessons of Vatican II. That in fact the church is not the cardinals and the hierarchy and the rabbis and everything. It's the people.
I think it's a great point. I hadn't really, I'll be honest with you. I mean, I think about the religious and philosophical implications, but for a long time I think I really wanted to put those aside. And I'd always focused on the political aspect of it. But I think that really what you're talking about here is very interesting, because if you can change the culture, and the religion is such an important part of it, if you can affect major decisions in the world's great religions, affect different policies, you can go a long way toward changing the fundamentals of the society, and which I think would make a political change a lot easier.
Than the secular. My experience in being a gov major at Harvard and studying at law school is that the people who in fact run for and retain political office in the United States are not leaders. They're not leaders at all. They're basically, most of them are engaged in kind of an attempt to verify their own ego. They're the same kind of people that the presidents of the fraternities and all that. They're BMOC types, the big men on campus types that like to strut around. And I've dealt with them for 20 years in Washington, D.C., that they exercise very little leadership. In fact, I've had dozens of instances where I'm sitting with a United States Senator or a congressperson, and I tell them, look, here are the facts of this thing. Here's the right things you need to do. And they look at me and say, you go out and get all kinds of people to tell me that I have to do this and make me do this, and I'll do it.
So in other words, the people have to be the leaders.
The people have to take the leadership on this thing. And so that what I want to do is I want to start directing our attention toward establishing a grassroots operation that is going to engage in disclosure rather than wait for disclosure from the secular government, and are going to engage in the philosophical and theological types of discussions that have to be undertaken, not waiting for the cardinals and the bishops and the popes to tell us what the answers to that are.
The president has got to be the person to take the authority.
Oh yes, that's right.
But he can be empowered by a civilian, citizen group. So let's do that. What he's going to have to do, nevertheless, is he's going to have to liberate people who have taken security oaths on UFOs from that oath so that they can speak about it without legal
Yeah, and so we need, the commission has to consider making that demand upon the president.
Once that happens, that will open the floodgates out, because there's going to be thousands upon thousands of people who are going to have their story to tell. And by then, then the problem will be sorting it all out and really making sense out of it. But we can do that.
The instant that this revelation takes place of the existence of this extraterrestrial civilization, people are going to run and first turn on their television to see what the president is going to say.
That's right.
And then they're going to go to church. They're going to go to the synagogue. They're going to go to the mosque. That's exactly what's going to happen. And so what I'm saying is that neither one of them is prepared at the present time to know what to say. And so the fact is that, and they're not going to get prepared. They've had 60 years, both of them, that know that this is going on, and they haven't prepared themselves yet. And so what we have to do is to prepare ourselves to have the answer to this ahead of time, so that, they aren't going to necessarily rush right straight to the television and say what the president's going to say about this, because they've already figured it out. And they aren't going to rush into church and say, what's the priest going to tell me to think about this thing? Because we've already been discussing this. And we've been holding meetings in public libraries, we've been holding meetings at the schools, we've been holding meetings in the parish halls, right?
Well, let me just say, in this brief conversation we've had, I think you've persuaded me that this is a really good idea. I had really been unsure about what a citizen movement really could accomplish on this. I mean, it's crazy to think that. But I was skeptical that it really could accomplish a lot. But I'm thinking about this, Stan, and I think that I think it's a great idea, because there's got to be a voice that has a well thought out plan. And if we can be part of an organization that is able to come up with a well thought out plan, the day will come when there is a shock to the world. People will be looking around for the right ideas that's going to help them get through this. And there will be organizations that might be there to help provide some initial guidance.
And I think what we want to do is we want to try to develop people in each parish around the world. And the Catholic Church has great reach around the world. In every congregation, in every mosque, that we want to have an element of their own community who has been talking with them about this, who's been inviting them to these discussions, who's been having these kind of discussions. We want to be able to have a citizens commission that's been in place, that has been articulating what the demands are that we have, has been organizing people politically to demand these kind of changes. And if in fact the legislative representatives or the presidential candidates in the two political parties don't want to be willing to do this, then you replace them. That what we do is we start to take seriously our democracy, and we start to take seriously our religion. I mean, radical suggestions, both of them. Right. But the fact is, I suggest that we start taking both of these things seriously before we get shocked by this whole thing, so that we don't have to get stunned into this and go running to the president or running to the Pope and asking them to tell us what to think. Because the fact of the matter is, it's our earning the answers ourselves that may well be the instigating factor that tells the ET civilization that it's time now for us to be prepared for this. Because I don't think they want to shock us. They have no desire to shock us and to traumatize us. They've been working at this thing for thousands of years.
You and I have taken the time, energy, and trouble to educate ourselves. And once we have seen serious, impressive, various types of evidences, we do tend to believe, because belief is based in this case on real evidence rather than faith, that's right. That we have a genuine situation here. I cannot predict what the results of the freeing up and dissemination of this information will bring. Will it bring a new age of all of us feeling close together? Will it fracture Western society? Will there be extremists at both ends of welcome the space brothers and kill the aliens? I think only time will tell.
What I find interesting is meetings at the X conference and wherever I go, here we are, grown adults now, still obsessed with this question about whether we're being visited, who are we, and what does the government know? And for years, we've been trying to get these answers. Sometimes I think we get very close to finding out what's going to happen, and then other times I think we're never going to find out. And as we evolve into this, my thoughts are that disclosure will come from whistleblowers, not from government. There's not going to be a full-fledged government news conference. There's not going to be a presidential announcement. Folks, we've been visited, they're here. It's going to come from the astronauts, from the military people, from the technicians who have seen things, who have heard things, and someone's going to go public in a big way.
We are waiting for a day when our government comes forward and says, aliens are real, they're here. We're going to be waiting a long time. In my opinion, that day will never happen.
I'm Ron James. It's May 11th, 2010. I'm standing in front of the White House. This is the day after Paradigm Research Group presented its annual press conference at the National Press Club regarding the extraterrestrial presence here on planet Earth. People like Coast to Coast AM's George Norrie, George Knapp, Linda Moulton Howe joined activist Stephen Bassett here in Washington, D.C. to once again call upon the administration to finally disclose what the government knows about an extraterrestrial presence here on planet Earth.
The UFO phenomenon is more than a mystery. It is the harbinger of what I believe will be radical, even revolutionary change in our world. The continual, rapid transformation of our society, which has been occurring for the past several decades, is going to lead to an opening in the secrecy. It's a tidal wave that cannot be stopped.
Many await the day. Others struggle against the bureaucracies of the world, demanding answers. Still others scoff at the idea that governments will ever admit anything officially. And of course, there are still those who maintain that there is simply nothing to disclose, that there is no unknown presence at all. As we look at the vastness of the cosmos, one thing even the most skeptical of scientists can agree on. There is most certainly other life scattered throughout the billions of stars and planets that sparkle our night sky. It is an evolutionary imperative that we overcome our own issues, our own self-destructive behaviors, and defy all that threatens our survival. If we can, then sooner or later, we will traverse the stars. We will be a part of a bigger galactic family, and one day, no one will talk of the disclosure debate. Those future humans may laugh a little, staring out across planets and starscapes, about how absurd we were in the first place, how we could ever clamor for the disclosure of something that should have been obvious all along. We are absolutely not alone in the universe. Disclosure has already happened. The rest is details.